Resident Evil 4 represented a major shift for the horror series. It completely changed the gameplay from fixed camera angles to over-the-shoulder third-person shooting, and horror took a backseat to high-octane action. Resident Evil 5 further established that this was the future of the series. Some fans of the old games lamented the change in style, but they mostly missed the horror which the series was so known for. Before Resident Evil 6 went full action, Capcom did try to return the series to its roots, but in its then current gameplay style. Resident Evil Revelations was the result of that effort, and it did at least well enough to warrant the sequel. But how well does it manage to combine both the tension and horror from the old games with the action and third-person shooting of the newer ones? Is it worth your time?
Don't worry, I've done this before. Incredible.
The Queen Zenobia. This thing is lucky to be afloat.
Revelations sees the return of Jill Valentine, who hasn't been playable since her appearance in Resident Evil 3, barring the Resident Evil 5 DLC. The story takes place before the events of the 5th title, with Jill being a member of the BSAA organization. After the organization lost contact with Chris Redfield, Jill is being sent out with her partner named Parker to Chris's last known coordinates, which happens to be on a luxury cruise ship called the Queen Zenobia. There's no time to catch some rays, however, as because luck would have it, the ship is infested with unspeakable nightmares. Now Jill has to find Chris and discover what happened aboard the Queen Zenobia. While this is going on, there's another story about an aquapolis called Terra Grigia. The city was destroyed after a bioterrorist attack by an organization named Veltro 1 year prior to the events of the game. In the beginning, it seems like Terra Grigia and the Queen Zenobia have nothing to do with each other, but as the game goes on, it sets up a connection between the two. The game presents the player with a mystery. What are the secrets of the ship? What does it have to do with the destroyed city? And how does the disbanded Veltro connect to all of this? The mystery itself isn't all too engaging, and there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't get explained well enough. The story is sloppily delivered and the flashback chapters are very disjointed for the most part of the plot. If the story was somewhat interesting, it would be a problem, but since it doesn't deliver, it's hard to care. Between every episode, there's a previously on Resident Evil Revelations segment, which is awkward and unnecessary considering the format of the game. Characters are a bit of a mixed bag. Most characters introduced are fairly forgettable, with the most character being Jill's new partner named Lucian Parker. While he doesn't really have any staying power for future titles in the series, he's fun enough in this game and has an endearing quality to him. Jessica, however, is fairly one-note and forgettable, and the comic relief characters aren't all too funny or memorable as well. Dialogue is standard fare, with the exception of occasional cringe-inducing lines.
Me and my sweet ass are on the way.
They tend to suck the mood the game is going for completely out. Bad jokes and forgettable characters aside, Revelations' story is okay. It's there to serve as a context for the gameplay.
Hey, are you even listening?
We'll find you, Jill. I promise.
When Resident Evil 4 came out, it introduced the world to the over-the-shoulder style of third-person shooting, a style most third-person shooters nowadays have adopted. The 5th game continued what the 4th game started in terms of style and design philosophy, but by the time 5 came out, a lot of its mechanics were already being considered as outdated. Revelations fixes a lot of those complaints. It is the first title that lets you walk and aim at the same time, and the aiming reticle will now stick to the center of the screen. These are updates that were needed if the series wanted to survive. Being a 3DS game, some shortcuts needed to be made. There are several control options, which allows for a control scheme that will most likely fit most players' preferences. You can play it with shooting mapped to the face button. While aiming, you can walk around by holding one of the triggers. There's also the ever so classic face buttons aim scheme, PSP style. Players can also use the CirclePad Pro peripheral, which makes it control as it would with modern controllers. if you are willing to hunt down the peripheral and sacrifice the portability of the 3DS. The new 3DS supports a native analog control stick option, but considering the new 3DS's control nipple feels so awful to use, it's not really recommended. The game also takes some notes from previous Resident Evil games, pre-third-person shooter style. Instead of the more open levels and linear paths, the Queen Zenobia is claustrophobic, and players can explore any part of the ship if they so choose to. Certain keys are required to open doors that lead to new parts of the ship. It's all very reminiscent of the old games, but reminiscent is all it is. While players can freely run around the ship, the game's still fairly linear. Every episode has an objective, and actually visiting previous areas only really rewards some ammo and the like, but nothing more. Still, it does sell the idea that you're exploring an entire ship. The Queen Zenobia is mostly small and tight, and that means the enemy count is lower, but it also changes the way you approach encounters. It is a different pace from its predecessors, but despite all of this, the level design can come over as somewhat disappointing when it's compared to the previous two games. Those had enemy encounters be a thrill ride, with unique mechanics and sublime level design that promoted traversal and experimentation. All that is mostly gone. There are one or two parts in the game that take the same approach, and they're by far the best sections of the game. While you will mostly play as Jill exploring the fairly open ship, there are some even more linear parts of the game, where you will play as another character. These parts are pretty much high-paced action to break up the slower parts of the game. Like the level design, some of the best systems from the previous games are sadly absent. The much beloved attaché case was already being downgraded in Resident Evil 5, and now it's completely absent. Instead, players can carry a maximum of 5 healing herbs. Grenades are on a separate weapon slot, which is shared with the knife, and you can only carry 3 weapons at a time. There are 5 weapon types, with each 3 or 4 variants. There's the always trusty pistols, the shotgun for close encounters, the sniper for long engagements, assault rifles to mow down a crowd, and the classic Magnum and Python for when you want to obliterate anything in your path. Weapons can also no longer be upgraded anymore. Instead, players will find custom parts that can be equipped into guns to give them certain buffs. You can also find ammo cases, which expand the ammo capacity of a certain weapon type. Taking a note from the third game, Revelations has a dodge mechanic much like it, in that when a player presses any direction just when an enemy attack is going to hit, makes them dodge. That isn't to say Revelations doesn't bring anything new to the table. Melee options have been toned down to suit slow combat in this game, and getting enemies in a stunned state for melee attacks is much harder now, but attacks can be charged for more damage. A glimpse of the series' future can also be seen here, when you select the first-person aiming option. The game still plays the same, but instead of aiming over the shoulder, the game goes into a first-person mode. This mode doesn't really add anything, but it's a neat little feature to play around with. The two biggest aspects of this game are the Genesis and swimming. Revelations injects a bit of the best part of the Metroid Prime series with Genesis. Genesis is a device that lets you scan the environment for hidden items and enemies. Once you hit 100%, you will gain a herb. It's a neat little addition that comes in handy and will have players scan every nook and cranny. It's just too bad that the game didn't take more from Metroid Prime's scanning system, as having a database with enemy info and models would have been neat. Since Jill is trapped on a derelict ship, some flooding was bound to happen. When this happens, players will have to swim. Swimming controls really well, and the time it takes before drowning is so generous most players won't even get close to that. You can't attack while swimming, but you can easily unswim any enemy, making this game one of the few games where the swimming sections aren't frustrating. At the end of every game in the series, players unlock an extra mode, which most of the time is the incredibly addicting Mercenaries mode. While this mode is absent from the game, we get something different yet equally fun called Raid Mode. Raid Mode tasks players with going through sections of the campaign as fast as they can. Players can play from a wide selection of characters, which you can unlock by playing the game and leveling up. Leveling plays an important part in this mode, since enemies will also have a certain level, and the gap between your and the enemies' level will determine how hard it will be. Weapons bought here have their own levels, part slots, and perks, which can be bought with BP earned in both the Raid Mode and single player mode. You can tackle these missions alone or with a friend. Raid Mode is a ton of fun to go through, and focuses on what the TPS Resident Evil games do best: action. Going through the mode with a buddy is a blast that's sure to keep both of you occupied for some time after you finish the campaign.
I'm buying you lunch. I'm buying you lunch. I'm buying you lunch.
Over here!
with most levels being in raid mode, and you always being accompanied with an NPC partner in the single player mode, it's both weird and lamentable that the campaign can be played through in co-op. Revelations adapts a lot of ideas from several games, both at that point new and old, and it makes for a great game. But while it adds a lot, the different level design philosophy compared to the previous two titles make Revelations considerably weaker than those games.
Isn't that always the case?
Now this is what I call a cruise ship.
The Resident Evil series has been to a lot of locales. We've been on mansions, overrun cities, Spanish villages, prison islands, on trains, and much more. A deserted cruise ship makes perfect sense as a setting for a viral outbreak. While the Queen Zenobia features a lot of cold and dark metallic corridors, it also features a lot of high-class looking areas you'd expect to see in a mansion. The environments on the ship are pretty varied, and some places like the casino are beautiful in its extravagant classiness. All the segments where the player takes control of another character and the more action-focused parts of the game take place off of the ship, in more varied areas, making sure the players don't get bored of the Zenobia. For a 3DS game, Resident Evil Revelations is a looker. As a matter of fact, it might be the best looking 3DS game out there. Capcom made every effort to make the game look amazing graphically, but high-end graphics mean nothing if there aren't any good aesthetics behind it. Luckily, Resident Evil does this well. By far the biggest complaints about 5 and to a lesser degree 4 was that it lost its horror roots and instead drifted more into action territory, which was something a lot of fans lamented. Again, Revelations tries to address that by injecting the TPS style with the horror of the old games. The game can get pretty atmospheric, and the sound design will put players on high alert when they hear sounds in the distance. The monster designs are top notch, thanks to the new virus outbreak that seems to have some deep sea DNA injected into it. Every monster you come across looks horrible, and have elements of already horrible sea creatures mixed in. Things like fins, leeches, crustaceans, clams, and much more make these monsters especially grotesque, even compared to the previous games. The overall package looks really nice, with the one and only complaint being that characters' mouths don't move when they talk, which is very jarring. Other than that, the game is great in terms of presentation.
I'm buying you lunch. I'm buying you lunch. I'm buying you lunch.
Resident Evil Revelations is a solid side piece to the main series. Its story doesn't amount to much and it's disjointed, but not so much as to be frustrating or annoying. There are plot holes, but when the main narrative is as unengaging as it isn't that bothersome. Presentation wise, it's the best looking 3DS game, with amazing graphics and high-end CGI cutscenes, even if the models don't move their mouths while talking. The monster designs are disturbing, and the aquatic elements to them give for unique looking creatures in the series. The game is considerably more atmospheric and focused on tension compared to the previous action-oriented titles. Mechanically, it's the same third-person Resident Evil you know and love, but with some upgrades to make it a bit more contemporary. However, what made 4 and to a lesser extent 5 the highly regarded games they are, is missing here. The level design isn't nearly as engaging, and some aspects like the downgraded inventory system or the lack of weapon upgrades is lamentable. It makes for a game that, while still great, pales in comparison to the games that came before.
Enter greetings. No more.
We came to help, but did nothing.
Yeah, that's another review done. Didn't think I'd do these again, did ya? It's been a while since I've done one of these, but I'm super happy I finally got to do one again. So yeah, overall this review was kind of rushed because it needed to be out on the 31st of October or just a bit before it for Halloween. And I feel like I've loved a lot of shit in the review. I think the presentation aspect could have been way better. There's a lot more that I could have talked about. specifically about like things like the blue hues and the aquatic nature of the game, which is reflected in the soundtrack, and of course the visuals. But yeah, overall, I'm glad to be doing this again. I've never actually stopped. I kept writing reviews, but I haven't really recorded any. There's quite a few on the back burner, but as soon as I can, I'll get to them. And I hope to be pumping these ones out a bit more, or at least quite a few before the end of the year. So yeah, with that said, if you guys have any criticism, any feedback, I'd love to hear it. And if you have any suggestions about what I should tackle next, let me hear it. I'd love to hear that, if that's even going to be a thing. And with that said, I hope to see you guys next review, and happy Halloween! Oh, and quickly, thanks Jake for helping me out with the raid footage. I really appreciate it.